Brilliant. Okay, testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. So thank you all for coming to my talk today. I'll be discussing that of the level design process behind making the game of Cyberpunk 2077. Before we get into this though, I do have to do a bit of kind of housekeeping. Please do turn your phones on silent. And then also, if you could rate these talks as well, it helps develop. They did also ask to make sure to give this talk 5 stars. I didn't say that, they did. So please follow through on that. And if we could please also just get a round of applause for the team working behind Develop to make this the best that it can be. So thank you, everyone. Now that I've got your hands moving, can I get a show of hands who've actually played Cyberpunk as well? All right, that's good to know that. I was genuinely worried a little bit. So we're going to be talking about a lot. A bit about me, though, first is my name is Max Pez. I'm principal level designer, currently contracting at multiple different studios. I've worked at a range of different studios over the last decade, which makes me feel extremely old, but I've had the privilege to work on a range of different games as well, from mobile, indie, and AAA, learning from some incredible developers and learning about different projects through that. Some of you may recognize my voice. I'm the host of Level Design Lobby. My father always did say I had a face for radio, sadly, but also that I do write stuff like level design books, and I am also a contractor right now as well. So there's going to be a lot that we're going to be discussing, and many of you are going to take away different things from this talk. And we're going at quite a breakneck pace for it all. But the main things that I'm going to be discussing throughout this is really about us working as a team. What was everyone doing in their different disciplines to help make that of Cyberpunk such an incredible experience? The design process behind the level we're going to be talking about in this talk. And then working with brands, there's a lot more going on now with brands being video games and kind of learning about how that goes, how the pipeline discusses with that. And not all that glitters is gold. There is a lot of mistakes that we made, so hopefully throughout all of this, you'll be able to learn stuff that hopefully stops you from making similar mistakes for it. So first thing is that we're going to be talking and focusing on the mission called Chippin'In, which is a really great one for us because the fact that
Slime.
here,
you'll unlock his first quest, Chippin'In, once you've completed 4 major branches of story missions: Automatic Love with Judy, Life During Wartime with Pan Am, Transmission with the Voodoo Boys, and Search and Destroy with Takamura. The conversations with Johnny that take place after those missions compose Tapeworm, the side quest that opens up a number of missions related to Johnny's life. Chippin'In is the beginning of Johnny's questline, so you'll want to knock that one out for sure. Head to the afterlife to kick it off and allow Johnny to take control while you're there. Completing this quest earns you Johnny's extremely powerful pistol, and can also get you his Porsche if you spare Grayson's life toward the end of the mission.
Thank you. That there where you pick up the Porsche is going to be the mission, the area that we're focusing in on that of Chippin'In. Now, the information about the quest is that it's the wrap-up of Johnny's Silverhand, right? He's come back to go focus on that of tying up his loose ends, looking and thinking about those that he's wronged and making amends for it, but also seeking that of vengeance as well on those who wronged him while he's still alive. We're going to also be looking at, as I said, Ebunike itself, the main location of this, the big kind of reveal for many of the different characters involved in this, and seeing how we turn this kind of dry docks into something far more interesting for that of the player. So let's go into discussing who worked on what and what was the team dynamic like when working on this level. So for me, I was in charge of blocking out the spaces, planning that of the routes that the player would take. Over on Quest was Pavel Sasko. He was taking the information from narrative and trying to consider how do we actually transform that to work in the medium of games. Now, Timur was our environment artist who I'd got to work with on other levels and just a genuinely lovely guy. And from that there, we kind of built a dynamic, but he would take my ugly blockouts and make them beautiful and match that of the theme. We had Pavel K, who was our QA, making sure that things worked right and also giving suggestions for what can be improved and how different play styles would actually work. Over on that of the narrative, we had Ola, which is an incredible woman. She's just helped me a lot throughout my transition of moving out to Poland. And she was that of the narrative designer, working on the overall narrative for the mission, thinking about kind of the themes and story for this. And we were lucky enough to have all of those at Treehouse Ninja, who are able to provide additional support with such as lighting and VFX to make this really stand out and feel alive. Now, traditionally, the role of level design is that ourselves, concept art, environment art all work on the architecture of this space, thinking about what kind of style buildings do we want. But it's on us to think about that, of making sure that we can facilitate gameplay, taking all the tools that the gameplay designers have made and giving it space to really show and shine. We also think about that of guidance, letting players know what is their objective and how do they get there. We want to control out the flow, understanding when players get that tension inside them, as well as breathing for a moment to catch their breath. And we do this all through scripting. Now, when I had joined that of CD Projekt Red, this was just when they were wrapping up that of the Blood and Wine DLC. And level design was kind of a new thing for them. And their kind of pipeline throughout the Witcher development process was more environment artists would build all the space, and then quest designers would script it. But it's a new IP, and a new team is now welcomed in. So we thought, well, they're going to enjoy working with us. Not necessarily. They really were more concerned that of feeling that they didn't want us to take over how they were working or feeling like they were losing control. So this is the first problem, the first challenge as a team we had to think about. How do we make sure that we don't feel that we're encroaching on them, and they also understand how important level design is, especially on the game and the IP of Cyberpunk. The second challenge we had was in terms of priorities. This here's the team, but we also had so many other missions and elements in the open world that we had to go through and create. Olga's not even on this, but trust me, she was working on many different main missions, side missions, promotional material, all of that. So how do we balance that? This is the second challenge for us. This is just a snippet of the locations that I worked on in the world. Just to give you an example, they were all doing the exact same. Then the third issue for us that we found was that of distance, with myself, Pavel K, and Ola all being located in Krakow, and then Timur and Pavel S over in Warsaw. And for many of you who may not have been to Poland, that's like the same distance, say, between like London and Newcastle. So it's quite a bit there. The good news is, though, it was all something we were able to figure out. And then COVID came in and threw a little spanner on that. And I definitely gained weight like this lad over here. But with that there, we had to figure out, how do we progress? How do we make sure that we're able to deliver? So the first thing we came up and really focused on was that of the pipeline for us. We discovered that it's best for us as the LDs to block out the spaces, think about the elements of the routes that are available for all these different play styles, as well as making sure that we are in control of scripting the AI and that of the puzzles. Environment art would focus with the fact that Night City is such a huge metropolis of an open world that they would first be in charge of building the base layer for us over in that of the blockout. Then they would come through and make sure our world and our levels look beautiful. Quest designer would work really closely with that of narrative design and would really be in charge of scripting that of dialogues, as well as speaking with that of the animators to make sure that they had enough space to go through and implement that of any cutscenes and communication scenes. Now, there's obviously a lot of other teams as well working on this project. So what we decided to do was figure out who should be the point of contact for all of these other teams as well. So no one would be left out. As many of you know here, communication is the first thing to break in any game. But by assigning that of a point of contact, if anyone had any questions, then they know who to speak to, and we can always make sure that communication lines were clear and open for that. Now, again, we're more focusing on this aspect, but I do want to highlight there's other incredible developers out there that work around with us. Now, the next thing for it is, with that of distance and COVID kind of ruining and changing and shaping all this of game dev, how do we do this? How do we deal with all these elements? The first thing I recommend is kickoffs. Getting your team together to understand who's on this team, who's in charge of what, and just building a sense of camaraderie instead of that of just, oh, hey, so-and-so is working on it. The more likely you are to get to meet someone, the better it is, and the more likely you are to continue to talk to them. Level design documents. Now, everyone has different ways of making them, but I think it's really important that even if it's called an LDD, it's not just on the level designer. Have that of your other teammates work on it. Create slides for them to use. So again, they're able to instantly come in and feel valued not only as an opinion, but also it's a quick way to iterate, as it's easier to remove a few documents than it is to go and change an entire block out. Online meetings, as we said, it wasn't so easy for us to go over and talk to everyone via just going and seeing their desk. But by having scheduled times for this, everyone would know when it was time to talk about and think about questions leading up to these meetings. So schedule time for everyone. Now, with more of us working in a hybrid or remote kind of fashion, online messaging is the very quickest way to communicate. However, there are some drawbacks. One of that is if you and your teammate decide something and don't share it with the other team, it can be lost in translation. So don't be afraid to message, but make sure to relay that team. And then finally, reviews as well. One of the biggest things is it's easy to go and sit down with your own discipline to learn and review. But again, coming together as a team really encourages that of working together and also understanding where everyone's coming out at a point of view. Now, this is kind of like a broad aspect, but when you're working with all these different disciplines, everyone's looking for different information to take away from when you're looking over the design documents or talking to one another. And I believe by talking and focusing on different teams' wants and needs, and especially as an LD, where you're in charge of so much communication, understanding each team and how they work will only speed up your process and just create more kind of sense of gratitude. When LDs think that they're busy, trust me, environment artists normally 10 times worse in that, and asking them to play your level is like pulling teeth. But by establishing, hey, come play with me, it's a great way to create that of clear boundaries for establishing, hey, this area is really gameplay heavy, please don't touch too much, but this area here, hey, go crazy. It's completely up to you what you want to add to this. It's just a corridor or a different kind of viewpoint. All of this helps, again, to encourage teamwork for it. Quest designers, these are the first time I'd ever worked with quest designers over in CD Projekt Red, and they are definitely the biggest kind of film buffs I've ever met in my life. So make sure you have that of references. But as you can see, Chippin'In is a lot of different locations. We're focusing on one. What I love about that is they focus on the broad picture, kind of looking about how it all connects and leaving those minute details to us. So that's on us not to ask those questions, but to take that responsibility and run with it. QA is often the unsung heroes in many different ways in this industry, but by showing them appreciation and giving them clear boundaries of what, hey, this is what we need, good repo steps, it just makes them, again, feel more involved versus that on the outside. So the summary for my kind of teamwork experience when working that of Cyberpunk is that of trust, right? We really want to make sure that everyone's built together and they feel that they're growing together. When you can trust your teammates, it makes things a lot more fun and also makes things far more understanding compared to feeling that you're constantly battling for, no, this is the time for art to shine. No, this is the time for LD to shine. We're all trying to make the best end product. Communication, as we talked about, it falls by the wayside so quickly. And especially in the position of LDs, we need to make sure that we're constantly communicating, constantly giving updates to everyone. So listen to them and speak to them as much as possible. And finally, there's no need for egos in this. Again, we all want to make the best thing possible, but it's not just about thinking about our each and own individual portfolios. It's about thinking about making the best game that we possibly can make. And for me, it was the first time that I'd actually moved abroad as well. And after now contracting, whether I'm working with all these different amazing companies around the world, you've got to understand that everyone communicates differently. And I think this phrase here is just one that just to live by, where it feels like, oh God, everyone feels a little bit cold to me, but really everyone's just worried and trying to make the best they can with all the constraints that they face. So now that we talked about team, we're going to be focusing that of what it was like working and designing for that of the universe in Cyberpunk. So we're going to go through and show you kind of a playthrough of that, of the layout.
Good as it's going to get.
So we're now accompanied by our companion here, Rogue. We can see the boat, which is where the objective is, kind of foreshadowing where we need to go, teasing that location.
She's tense. Cover her just in case.
Now, players here can go and challenge themselves in different ways. They can follow Rogue and do a stealthy pass, or they can go in guns blazing and really just change up the entire way that this plays out, moving AI around. Now, I'm just going to skip this because this this player takes a while on this. Now, we also really wanted to make sure that the players felt like they're trespassing into an area they shouldn't be. So really, I really looked at the references of Metal Gear Ground Zeroes and making it feel much more of an area that they were crossing into and trespassing.
Watch it now.
As we complete this first challenge here, I really wanted to kind of pinch this area, make it feel like there's a transition point for it, as well as making it feel much more claustrophobic before this grand reveal here. And we see that at the objective with the boat, feeling very ominous, drowning in that red light. And from up here, we get to see a lot of different routes the player can take, giving them a chance to make their decision before moving onward. When the player drops down, I really want this to be a safe area for the player. So there's a lot of cover here, and we've fenced off this area entirely. With stealth being such a big part of our game, we need to make sure that the player really thought about their exit strategy, being able to hide out of bodies versus them being spotted and alerting all the rest of the enemies. And not only is this a lockdown for a drug facility, but it is the home of the Maelstrom. So we really wanted to show that with enemies sleeping and giving you a chance to take them out. But again, giving that sense of presence that, again, we're in a place we shouldn't be. We need to think about loads of different ways that players can get into buildings. You see, you can really upgrade yourself. So it's fascinating to make sure that even at the roof, there was a way into this location.
Scan it, see if there's anything we can use. I'll watch the door.
Now, knows exactly where to find him. She's stalling. Told you, Rogue's still scared of the asshole.
And that was a real important point for us, is again, giving these scenes a moment to shine, making sure that we're not just considering all these bombastic locations that players can go shoot out, but making sure the scene had good blocking in order to deliver the narrative that we wanted to focus on.
Over there, to the right.
Okay, so this here is where we're going to end that bit for now. We're going to go a little bit further. But one of the things we had was kind of the core pillars that we had to adhere to when designing. The first one being that in freedom of story. There's many different endings in that of Cyberpunk, but many different kind of cutoffs and different points of missions that you can unlock or end depending on how you play as the character. So we need to make sure that's felt and thought about throughout all the spacing. Think about the freedom of the world. This is an open world game. So the player needs to be able to go off and take and address it how they see fit, making sure that they can explore or go through the main missions or the side content how they wish to. And that freedom in gameplay, not only do we want that in terms of the narrative, we want the player to feel like they're playing their story. After all, this is based on a tabletop RPG, so again, they feel that they're in control. And one of the ways that we do this is through the different play styles that we were able to offer them. Now, the player could upgrade in any different way that they want to. They can invest all their abilities in one if they wished, or they could go through and divide their points up and distribute to make a really kind of well-rounded character, which was great, but also a headache for us to figure out how the player was going to look when they got to our missions. So what we had to consider were kind of the main kind of play styles for that. Solo is more of that who believes their body is the weapon, that they can unlock abilities to be athletic, as we saw in the video, double jump around. They can open up heavy gates as well as dealing damage with their bare fists. But yet we had that of the Netrunner too, where they believe their mind is their weapon, and they can then unlock different security systems as well as connect to and fry that of different enemies. Now, Techie is not necessarily a play style, but you do have different abilities you can upgrade in that. Think of it more of a complementary ability list that can, again, help transition how you move. But then there's players who may not even want to upgrade their skill tree at all. So we need to make sure that players can still get in this, whether that's through combat, as we saw, you can do range weapons, or use that of melee weapons, or for players who want to be like a ghost, getting in and out. So there's a lot of that to think about, but we had to facilitate all of these different playstyles for it. So we had to think about then, well, what's the different way to do this? How do we actually divide this up? We thought a lot of different ways. We thought about having unique routes, so you'd unlock them and just go through it. We thought about opening it just all up completely, that there wasn't really much of skill checks in general. But we kind of nailed down that the funnel level design was the best approach for the style game we were working on, making sure that we opened it up for players to choose, mix, and match their paths, but still make sure that they don't miss key narrative beats. Because the real mantra over at CD Projekt Red is that the story and narrative is king. So we need to make sure that the player doesn't miss any of that. Now, when it came to this mission, I was working over in the Krakow studio at the time. I would go work at Warsaw a little bit later, and I was asked to join this during about 2019, and we're releasing it in 2020. And as we know, there was a lot of pushbacks as well. And I was told, don't worry, there's plenty of time. We've already got the blockouts done. It was due to the fact that one of our LDs had left, a really nice guy called Łukasz. And then I saw these kind of blockouts and realized, oh, there's a lot of work to do here and plenty of time, right? Not always the case, I wish it was. But I was told, don't worry, again, we've got kind of the objective, we know where we're going with this one. So I started to speak to the team, understand what it is we're after. We need to go over there and beat Adam Smasher. We're gonna have a boss battle with him over in the hull itself. The player can come attack and do this mission at any time of day. So we had to plan for both night and daytime for it. Then the theme of this would be that of a dry docks, hence the boats, hence the cargo, all of that. There wasn't going to be any companion. If you saw and if you have played the Chippin'In quest, there are moments when Johnny Silverhand takes over the V's body, and we're going to have that in this situation as well, where Johnny Silverhand was playing as V during this time. The enemies were that of the Maelstrom, and we're going to have this epic boss battle that was going to be like, yes, Adam Smasher, an iconic character. It's going to be great. So where do I start? I've got information, but what do I do really from here? The first thing for me was to understand where this mission actually took place. This was over in Watson. During our time as LDs, we were each assigned different districts to work on. Watson was not mine. So I had to go off and study and learn, well, what's in Watson? What is it that makes it unique versus others that I have worked on? Really understanding this, understanding who was in charge, how the people live, it would give me a base of reality to actually base the location from. Not only that, we had this great kind of art direction, which was telling us all these styles that we had to think about. Now, I was in charge of Charter Hill, which is more of a neo-militarianism style, but this one was more about entropism, which is more about necessity over style, making sure that things work. This is not an affluent area. And by understanding this, understanding the people, the architecture, it made me get a clearer picture of, okay, what am I dealing with for it? The other element of that is the Maelstrom gang. Now, I had not worked with them. I'd worked with Animals, Sixth Street, and a few others. And for me, it was more about thinking, well, what is it about them? Now, I went back, read the tabletop RPG, kind of studied that. And luckily in 2019, we released this demo as well. So I actually went through and played this mission multiple times over to kind of understand them better in terms of the gameplay systems as well. And from this, we really learned that this may be a gang, but it's not a very rich gang. If any of you have played this mission, you'll know that this is a converted food factory. So they don't own this. They didn't have it custom built for their evil, nefarious plans. They've repurposed it. And by studying that and that of the tabletop, I learned that the way that this gang makes its most money comes from drug sales as well. You can see by looking at them how kind of like messed up they are physically, constantly upgrading themselves at the cost of their humanity. So I had to think about, well, how would they live? Why don't we look at making a space that is their home for this? And from that point, it was very clear what it was that I had to go through and what it is that I can upgrade with it. Now, Dum Dum here, you will see, will offer us some lovely drugs, and V here is a say no to drugs kind of person. But again, it really showed that element of how important drugs was to them. And then finally, looking over at Adam Smasher, like I said, this iconic villain, if any of you have seen the Edge Runners anime, you'll know how badass he looks in that. So really to have a chance to play with that character was like, man, this is going to be challenging, but that boss battle is going to make this mission iconic. And from that, I started to look over the different types of architecture. One of the things that was sad to see, but also a big inspiration, was over in Shanghai. Sadly, a lot of people can't afford the cost of living. There's a cost of living crisis we know now. But a lot of them were taking old containers and repurposing them as houses, which was fascinating to see. And then also you had this high-end version where instead of buying a house, why not buy all these containers and make your quote-unquote dream home? So to see that, and hey, Cyberpunk's based in alternative reality, why don't I take something that's already pre-existing in the world and build it into the actual believability of our space? From this, I also saw that with drugs, how would Maelstrom get them in and out Night City? And I saw those train tracks in Watson, which was great for me because that's clear as day. Hey, look, they can move it throughout the train system. Understanding all of this started to paint a much clearer picture for this. And from that, we sat down and decided to rediscuss a few elements for that of this game, this mission. And we decided that you were still going to find Adam Smasher. Okay, great. The time of day was now going to be night. This one came a little bit late, and we'll talk about this being a little bit of a problem for it. But the theme had changed. By doing all that research, by looking at those references, it was no longer just going to be a boring kind of dry docks loading bay. It actually had meaning in it. We could make it about and tell more stories of the gang with Maelstrom by making it their homes, making it a drug facility. We're now going to have a companion, which is very new for me in terms of this stage working with companions. The enemies were still going to remain Maelstrom, great. And we just secured a deal with Porsche. You were going to be able to get this in my level, which was super cool to see about that. But the big change, as I said, was that of the AI companion. Understanding more of, well, how do we work with this? Coming off Division, I'd worked with multiplayers, but never with actually an AI companion, and how can we make this? We're all aware of the painful memories of Resident Evil 4 and Ashley and looking after her. So how do we avoid that? So for me, it was understanding who our companion is. It was going to be Rogue, the queen of the afterlife. She's such an iconic character that players were already going to meet throughout the game. So we really had to think about how do we make her feel as badass as the player has seen her. So we made sure that she was on the playstyle of a solo, making her not only strong in how she communicates with you, but strong in actual physical abilities that she provides in the level. In terms of her weapon, it was going to be a pistol, again, establishing she's more close range than long range compared to, say, Silent in Metal Gear Solid 5. Again, showing the brutality of her. She was also a potential love interest for the player. So we had to think how your actions in this mission could impact the romance from this. She's a quest giver too. As I said, players had seen her all the way through. So we need to make sure that those kind of ties and bonds was felt in the gameplay. Now, noticing the objective, it was not to beat Adam Smasher, it was to find Adam Smasher. So we had to think about how do we bait and switch the player, going from the iconic villain to his companion there, Grayson, for it. So we really wanted to kind of imagine taking the air out of the balloon for this, having all this tension, making sure to find Adam Smasher, to then find that he's not there at all. But it was a real different one for us to think about how can we make that still feel good, but not necessarily unrewarding for the player. We thought about this AI companion with their playstyle, setting up traps for the player, making sure that it is a boss battle, but one that doesn't necessarily feel like it. And that you'd get the iconic Johnny's gun, the Malorian 35-16. So even when you beat him, you still felt rewarded for that. Now, in terms of the layout, there was a lot going on here. As I said, I was taking over from another LD. And I personally, I don't know about any of you, but when you're taking over work from someone else, I always feel that little bit of guilt with like, how much can I change? What was your design intentions? But Wukish had gone. He wasn't there to help answer my questions. And I couldn't necessarily see where he was going with it or what the plan was for it. So I spent a lot of time thinking, how do I do this? But luckily, because the objectives had changed, it was clear to me it's okay to go through and start from scratch and really make something that fits that of the new objectives. The first bit of this was breaking down the layout itself, making sure it's clear in terms of what the spaces is used for, making it believable how Maelstrom would actually use this space while actually going on their day-to-day lives before the player even got there. The other thing we then had to think about was planning out the routes. There was different challenges at different ones, but think about, well, if the player upgrades in this way, how is best to give those options to it? Now, the first one we'll be focusing on is that of the first challenge that the players has over here. And that here is when we come to the entrance. As I said, there's different ways the players can address it. They can go full combat, where as soon as they kill them, the gates will open, alarms will go off, and enemies will start charging out at the player. Or they can follow Rogue and take through the stealth ability. The thing was, is we were really struggling with how do we get the player to feel a sense of they're going to be overwhelmed by the different enemies. And this took us a long time, but the way that we figured it out was making sure that we had enemies close by. One of them's on the phone and the other one's listening in the conversation. We instantly get to see them. Rogue's dictating the pace by her hiding behind the beam. And then once they finish their conversation, they would then go off to their own kind of different patrols and elements of that. So again, it's showing the space by the enemies moving through it, giving a teaser of what different options the player has. And by the options, we had different devices to use distractions, whether that's through the abilities of Techie, Solo, or the Netrunner playstyle. One of the things that we learned, though, when we were making this space overall, was that, as you can see, 2 different devices isn't really going to work. So we came up with a great rule that you need to have 4 different devices per enemy for it. So no matter where the player is coming in from, they've still got a lot of different options available to them. Once we get through to this decision point here, we can see the different routes for it, highlighting different ways that players can go through. And by highlighting, we had to think about these different elements in terms of what do we do to show that. When the player enters their scan mode, they can see much more heavy density of that of devices over to the left, kind of highlighting, signaling, if this is how you like to play, come this way. If you want to be solo and just go heads first, well, hey, we've got enemies all the way over here for you, so just go get them. And then Techie, as I said, much more of a complementary route, but we're able to still use that ability with different gates as well, fencing it off. Once the player decided the routes, though, as we said, they can upgrade in many different ways. They don't have to follow the path that we've kind of laid out. We also had to give different opportunities for the player to redecide, rethink how do they want to continue and how do they want to adapt. That was really important for us by having that of tons of different decision points. This was crucial for our LD moments. Once you completed that of a challenge, whether it be an enemy, puzzle, either that of traps, there was always different routes available for the player to see and then choose to move forward from that. And again, we did that by planning out this space from it. Not only is it used for believability, but by having all these different sections, it's very clear to the player when they're transitioning and moving through and establishing that and creating a mental map for themselves, as well as using that of spatial composition. So when the player joins, as I said, and comes through the space, they're able to understand this first area is very safe for them. It's fenced off. There's tons of cover for them to use. And then when they're moving through to different areas, we change it up through height. It doesn't have to be a whole new floor. It can just be as simple as 20 centimeters to 1 meter. They still feel that difference. We really want to focus with the fact that we're repurposing containers. Which ones can you explore and which can you not? Because you can see in the picture here, we used it not only for that of livable spaces, but also as our boundaries with walls too. So we had to make that clear with that of clear openings, whether that be doors, windows, versus some that had 0 in it, as well as establishing architectural style for it. You can see I've used a couple of different triangles within the boundaries, one opening up with the garage, so it keeps the player pushing in, versus the one near the boat angled down, so you get a clearer view of the boat itself and the objective. As you can see, we're able to then create these different areas that are memorable for the player by using all of these different elements of spatial composition. Now we'll show the second bit of the layout itself. You can see you can handle this through stealth, but this player here really wanted the wow factor with the head rolling.
Not looking so hot. Even shittier on the inside.
But once they've done this, they've really changed what happens on the boat, which is really important for us. Because they entered combat, enemies will spawn in different positions now because of that, versus if they did it stealthily. And you can see here, we have this funnel point again with that of the stairs, so players are able to get this conversation with Rogue and still drowning in that red light, feeling they're transitioning to a new dangerous zone.
Was she always this curt with you too?
For a while.
When building the space as a hideout for Adam Smasher, this is one of the strangest things to think about, because how does an android shower? How do they sleep? And this was a real fun one to try to figure out through this. As you can see, there's different spaces, containers, again, repurposed and there.
Hear that?
Because the player entered combat down below, they're all clumped up at the back, ready for the player to come and be able to attack them.
Fucking shitting at me with my own gun. Valorian 3516. Signature sound. I'd know it anyway.
You're not getting out alive!
Will be anything
Let's
but
see what
this
you're
robot.
made of!
Now, we want to again show Rogue as a badass. So even behind us, she's the one that actually takes out Grayson. And that way we don't need to worry about it always as herself. Again, showing that she is capable in her own right. So when thinking about these, I need to wrap up as seeing the time, make sure that you're doing your research. The more references, research that you have, the bigger impact and more memorable a space can be. Understanding the core of your design, if your game isn't a shooter and you're trying to put in shooter aspects to it, it's not going to work out. Understand that and the mechanics that make things memorable for you. And remember, any key to a good level is iteration. There's a lot of that changed in that I didn't even cover half of it. Trust me, there was so much that went up and down with that space. Now, we're going to talk briefly about working with brands. I had the opportunity to go work with Porsche. Now, again, I didn't put this deal together, just to make it clear. I was just informed, hey, you're going to have Porsche in your level, which is super cool. But it is an iconic car with the 911. So many different fans are out there that love this, which again, put a little bit of pressure on myself because I wanted to make sure when the player got the car, they didn't feel that it was done by or felt that it wasn't respected enough for it. So we had to think about, well, how do we reveal this to the player? So once the player's defeated Grayson, we can see this container here, drowning in light, hovering above us, giving us that more angelic kind of feel for this. Players are then able to lower it down and then go back upon themselves. I will say, getting a container this size to fit the Porsche was much more agony than you thought it would be. The amount of things that went wrong with the containers and metrics was just, yeah, a little bit silly from it, but there was still a lot to learn from that. The player even finds some loot. And one of the big changes I talked about with iteration is this train tracks here. They weren't originally on this side. They were on the side where you actually got into the building first, into the area. Give that slow reveal for tension. A little bit of tease still.
Okay.
But this here was the reason in terms of why we moved the train tracks. Because the fact is, we wanted the player to be able to leave with this as soon as that they had finished with this. Again, leaving versus a different way that they came in. And how cool is it to leave with an iconic Porsche and just drive through Night City? So again, we really had to make sure the player felt badass and the player was able to cruise off when they wanted with this bit of a bumpy ride. Now, as I said, not all it glitters in gold. There was a lot to think about in terms of improvement for it. Making sure communication is respected, because there are so many different people, especially when you're working with a team this size for it, that players need to make, or I should say, devs need to make sure that they're constantly communicating. Some people just aren't great at it, but you need to establish that very early on in that of company culture. One of the things that we had was these containers, we'd actually color-coded these because we told it came in at any time. Yellow containers would hold loot, orange would hold that of enemies. So when we were told, oh, it's going to be done at night, well, you kind of lose the color on it because the lighting's changed completely. But that could have all been avoided if we just spoke from that. As the LD team, you'll notice that some of the levels feel very different in terms of how they play out. And I think one of the things that we went wrong with this is we never had a unified vision. We never sat down as a whole LD team and made the choice of what makes a quintessential Cyberpunk level. Because of that, everyone interpreted the rules, the mechanics in different ways. And I think having, again, a shared vision only makes it a lot easier for, again, you to break the rules, but also make sure the quality is raised up together. One of the things we had, as we talked about, is there's so many decision points, so many different routes the player can adopt and move through, that we almost feel like you kind of lost that power when making a decision. So we never had the chance to have the full distinct routes, giving something a memorable moment depending on which route you chose. So it was a real shame to lose that. As we talked about with teams and that, really, we all working at such different times we weren't there working at the same time on the mission together, which slowed it down, but also just again broke priorities. If you're working on a mission together, carve out time together with one another. Make sure you're playing it together. One of the things that I had with this is we would definitely review, but it was each one's discipline, never as a team itself. So we never really understood what each other was trying to achieve throughout the mission until it was a little bit too late. And if you don't have the time, delegate, empower. We talked about trust for your team. If you're able to give a chance for that of your team to come in and help out, that's great. That's what they want to do. So if you're busy, do delegate and do ask for people to go through. So thank you all very much. I do think we've got about 5 minutes for questions. Appreciate you. If you want to know more about level design, I teach at CGMA. I've got a couple books out on that. The shameless plugs, I know. But if you want to reach out to me anyway, you can through Twitter, email, and listen to the podcast for it. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. I think we do have some time for questions. Can we get the lights up as well, please, buddy? If you do have a question, please put your hand up. Someone will run around with the mic. And if you could introduce yourself when you ask the question too, so it's not just a sea of faceless people with a mic, that would be great too. So yeah, any questions? I think we have one over there. Is the mic on?
Hello.
Hello.
God, that's intimidating. I'll stand up because it's easy to see.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a level designer with Void Interactive.
Hey,
we
Jacob.
make Ready or Not. Just a question about your blockouts when you're making Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
So, like, when people make level designs, a lot of people say, like, people, I guess it varies from person to person, like how detailed they want certain things to be.
Oh, God. Yeah.
You see where this is going? So, like, when you're making, let's say, a landmark or, like, the boat, for instance, or just anything really that has even a significant amount of detail to it.
Yeah.
How do you go around doing that? Do you like over design it with the blocks, or do you just keep it simple? Because I've always kind of been on the latter half.
Yeah, so it was very different. As I said, I came off Division before joining, and we kept that very simple. We just used blocks. But over at CD Projekt Red, they really focused on whether you're playing this in blockout and full arted, they wanted to understand what the space was. So we went in tremendous detail. There was one LD, bless him, Peter, who like made all these different prefabs of like vending machines out of blocks, forklifts, like an insane amount of detail that we went into that. So it really ranges from place to place. After like learning from that, I tend to go more and more detail, but that has definitely bit me in the backside when moving to different places for it. So it's about understanding what your team wants, what your lead wants from that. I will always say that I'm more in line with going just a bit more detail simply because it's clearer what the vision is. The downside of that is when concept art come along to do paint overs, they don't feel they've got as much freedom because everything's clearly labeled to what it is. But again, it's more about your team establishing that versus saying, hey, Max told me to do this and I'm going to go forward with that.
So you'd say it's more of like a company to company thing.
Exactly, mate.
Brilliant.
But yeah, hopefully that answers that one.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, mate.
Appreciate it, mate. I don't know if we've got time for another question. If there's anyone up there, I think we've got one at the back and then one at the front. We can do both.
Hello. Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Fred Drabble. I'm a 3D character artist at Cathedral Studios. I just want to know a bit about how you control pacing with level design. Like, how do you control the pace of the game? How long levels take to do, I guess.
Yeah, so that comes from like us doing, when we talked about the LDD, what's really important for us is we'll do something called like a pacing graph, and we'll break down break down the mechanics into different kind of different sections, if you will, traversal, combat, puzzles, right? And then we'll assign a value to it, right? So say, for example, in our scenes, right? You can still talk, you can still move. So it's going to range from, in terms of intensity, from like 0 to a 2, depending on what's happening in the cutscene. Similar that with combat, right? That can range from, say, like a 2 to an 8 because there's one combat where I just have to kill one guy, and there's boss battles itself entirely. So by using that structure, we were able to go plan through that. One of the things you want to make sure when you're doing that is you never want a straight line, just overall, whether that's up, down, or across. So we go through this, look at it, and decide, hey, this doesn't work, this does work. And then once we've done that, we've implemented it, again, we test, we see what works for it. Is there too many guys? Is there less enemies here? Be better? This thing will help. So it was all through pacing graph, planning first, and then testing from that point, champ. Thank you very much for your question, mate.
Thank you.
I think we have one more down here.
Hey, I'm Finn. I'm a level designer with Nereal.
Hey,
I just wanted to ask about, you had kind of mentioned that the original plan for the level was to have a big boss fight at the end, and that then switched to kind of a fake out.
Yeah.
I wanted to know how that changed your approach to level, because I imagine those are two very different things to build towards, basically.
Yeah, so originally the boss fight was going to be in the hull itself. So we blocked out you were never meant to go on top of the ship, or like you were and you fell down or something. Very, very different in terms of how you got there. So the ship was also a little bit bigger for it. I then got told off because we'd already outsourced the boat to a different metric. So yeah, I had to change that a little bit. But yeah, so we changed that. We looked at how could we use the hull in a different way. There was a lot more containers in it. And then after that, we completely closed it off. And then it was all about focusing on the narrative at that point. As I said, in that playthrough you saw there, one of the cool things about watching people play with this game is you can YouTube that, and you can see many people play this very differently. But in that case, where we saw them when they got on the boat, all the enemies and stuff were clustered at the back. But if the player goes through stealthily unspotted, then they're all going through different containers, and you can see more of like the drugs, the contract in place between Adam and Maelstrom, Adam's like living quarters. So you get to actually explore more of that. So it was more focusing on delivering narrative that time. So again, very different, but that's kind of the big switch for it. So on top of the boat, under the boat, combat narrative for it. So yeah, a lot of time lost and a lot of time moving fast. So yeah, it's a cool one. But thank you so much for your question, mate.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, we are over, but just give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it, everyone. Thank you.